taken his place behind the bench. Let's listen in to a bit of the trial.
Jason Lindsay and George Peacock Jr., you are charged with high treason. How do you plead before the king and your God?
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
I call Colonel Henry Bostwick to the stand.
Your Honor, leading the witness.
Lieutenant, as you were, Colonel, did you witness Lindsay and Falwell engaging in crimes against the Crown? Did you apprehend said subjects during the capture of the rebels at John Dunham's cabin?
Yes, both of these men were found inside Mr. Dunham's cabin. As a matter of fact, we have reason to believe that Lindsay was one of the ringleaders of this particular group. They had, before we found them, they had terrorized the settlers up the lakeshore area and all up through the Grand River area. They had eluded us for several days prior to their capture.
Mr. Robinson?
Thank you. I have no further questions for this witness.
Lieutenant Boswick, could you clearly identify Mr. Lindsay and Mr. Peacock are being part of this so-called band of marauders?
Yes, I witnessed firsthand their actions during the raid and capture at Dunham's. I also witnessed the devastation caused by these scoundrels in Dover. A nasty pair, to say the least.
Thank you, Colonel. I now call upon Captain John Bostwick to the stand. Captain, do you agree with your brother's testimony?
Yes, Your Honor. Both Lindsay and Peacock were among the rebels captured at Dunham's. I overheard some of the others captured alluded to Lindsay as captain. Surely it seemed to me that he was the leader.
Thank you. Thank you, Captain. No further questions. I address my case, Your Honor. Jury.
Thank you. Now the jury will deliberate and render a verdict on behalf of the people. Jurors, have you reached a verdict, and will you tell this court if at this time?
Sir, unanimous guilty.
Guilty it be!
The trial of Isaiah Brink followed. Isaiah was 40 years old, married to Anne with 2 young children. Isaiah was charged with openly joining the marauders and committing acts against the settlers. Witnesses included Captain William Francis, Thomas Francis, and John Williams. He was found guilty. Benjamin Simons faced Chief Justice Scott shortly after. He had also been one who joined the enemy and helped pillage the neighbors. He too was quickly found guilty. Robert Troop followed and was found innocent. He was acquitted after a short trial. Next up on the docket was Adam Chrysler. Chrysler had been captured at McCrae's house. Witnesses included William Francis, Thomas Francis, James McQueen, and John Bonnet. After hearing testimony, the jury withdrew to consider their verdict. They returned finding him guilty. As the verdict is being read, we hear again some information from the spectators in the crowd.
Your Honor, please, this can't be. Have mercy on us all. Adam is the father of 9 children, and his brother has sat on your jury. Please, you have made a most grievous error.
I'm calling for a short recess at this time. I would like you to review and reflect upon your decision rendered in this courtroom today. This trial now stands adjourned.
Adam Chrysler got what he deserved. He was more guilty than any of it. He should be condemned to die for his actions. What do you say, Mr. McQueen? Will they go to death for the death sentence?
Well, they indeed will be going for the highest punishment. They will want to make an example of these men. We don't want this happening ever again.
I agree with Father. We need to make these men pay for what they have done. They need to hang.
Here. No. John Dunham is an American sympathizer. He allowed American invaders to use his home at Nanticoke Creek as headquarters for their raids and attacks. He is suspected of being a ringleader for the Americans, and he helped the rebels capture British citizens, taking them to Buffalo as prisoners. Let's listen in on his trial and see what his fate is to become.
John Dunham, you have been accused of high treason. Evidence proves that you were a ringleader. You allowed the Americans to use your home as a meeting place, and you participated with these rebels in raids against your neighbors. How do you plead?
Not guilty.
Mr. Prosecutor, call your first witness.
I call Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bostwick to the stand. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bostwick, what led to the arrest of John Dunham?
After Proctor's defeat and the withdrawal of the regular troops, two bands of rebels and others formed at Buffalo. One of these bands advanced along Lakeshore towards Long Point. The other moved up the Grand River. They proved by their conduct that they were marauders of the worst type. They approached Dover, stealing horses and cattle and plundering houses. The inhabitants were greatly alarmed and quickly called to arms 36 persons to discuss defending themselves and put a stop to this tyranny. I was chosen to command this group of volunteers.
What happened in the early morning of November 13th, 1813, at the home of John Dunham, Nanticoke Creek?
On the night of the 12th, we received information that a party of marauders were in the neighborhood. The few militia that were immediately near proceeded in search of them. The rebels, however, suspecting our intentions, hastily returned down the lake. On the 13th, in the early morning, the number of our volunteers increased, and we commenced marching down the lake in pursuit of the rebels. We surprised them at the house of John Dunham. We were in the area near the house, and Captain John Bostwick entered the house with Mr. Austin, Lieutenant Austin. The rebels instantly flew to their arms. Shots were fired. Hearing the shots, we hastened towards the place. They commenced firing on us, and we returned fire immediately. After the exchange of fire on both sides, we captured 18 prisoners.
Your Honor, clearly the accused has been the victim of circumstance. He was buffooned by these rebels.
Robinson, call your next witness, please.
I call Captain John Bostwick to the stand. Captain, do you agree with the account that your brother has given as to what happened at the cabin of John Dunham?
Yes, Your Honor. His account is most factual. I was the first to enter the premises of Dunham, along with Lieutenant Austin, and was wounded slightly when shots began. Mr. Dunham was clearly a part of this rebel group. He raised his gun at us almost immediately upon our arrival.
Thank you, Captain. No further questions, Your Honor.
If there are no further witnesses, I then instruct the jury to withdraw to consider the verdict.
We find the defendant guilty.
The following day, the last of the accused were tried. Noah Payne Hopkins was found guilty of having been the enemy's commissionary, supplying the troops with flour and other food. The trials were over after 2 weeks. Since the law imposed the penalty of death for treason, a stay was granted to allow each case to be reviewed to determine if grounds could be found for leniency. Late in June, the 15 accused were brought before Justice Thomas Scott. 7 were granted a reprise. 8 men were condemned to death.
Noah Payne Hopkins, John Dunham, Aaron Stevens, Benjamin Simmons, George Peacock Jr., Isaiah Brink, and Adam Chrysler. You have been found guilty of high treason. The punishment for this crime is death. You are to be hanged and all of your property, worldly goods confiscated. May God have mercy on your soul. Please, remove the prisoners from the court and have them taken to Burton Heights for their execution.
Hey, let's go, you bunch of traitors. March to the right place. You're all soldiers. March. Not fair. No, no, man. No, man. Go on. No, man.
On July 20th, the sentence was carried out.
Oh, one short. I can get out one short.
I might have lost control.
Oldest guy gets the ball.
Epilogue. Maria Chrysler Stevens was very fortunate. Friends and neighbors bought back the lands confiscated after his death and returned it to her. Elizabeth Chrysler, not so well off, ended up destitute and having to give away her children. William Francis, who had testified against Isaiah Brink, Isaac Pettit, and Adam Chrysler, is murdered on October 28, 1814, by a band of American rebels led by John Dixon at his home near Selkirk, clearly in retaliation for his testimony. He was shot in the head and his house set afire. Johnson, Pettit, and 5 others were granted clemency. 3 prisoners died of typhoid in prison, 4 received pardons, and 1 escaped. The War of 1812 officially ended on February 17, 1815, after nearly 6 months of peace negotiations in the city of Ghent. The initial terms of peace were drafted in just 10 days, but it wasn't until December 24, 1814, that negotiations for both sides agreed to the terms. Great Britain ratified the Treaty of Ghent on December 27, 1814. A British packet ship delivered the treaty to New York City on February the 11th, 1815. The Secretary of the State, James Monroe, received the document in Washington a few days later. The United States Senate unanimously approved the treaty, and President Madison signed it on February 16, 1815. All prisoners of war were immediately released. The end.